Hello, welcome to Exotic Gardening UK, Yorkshire Kris Weekly, and on this week's episode I'll be showing you how to overwinter all the range of exotic plants that are small enough to keep in pots. So in this video I'm going to go through all the types of exotic plants that are grown in pots and how to overwinter them, what temperatures, what conditions they need, and also at the end of the video I'll do basically a surefire tip of how to get pretty much any plant through the winter. So we'll start off with one of the main groups of plants that you may have in pots, especially when it's small, and that is bananas. So here I have a onset banana, and we've done videos about overwintering these when they're big, where they've been grown in the ground, but now we're looking at the smaller ones that are just in pots. And as you can see, this is a small specimen of onset ventricosum, the straight green form. It's a little bit tatty at the moment, had a bit of sunburn earlier in the year, and this is not big enough to dry store or to sort of, keep in a conditions where you're sort of keeping it dormant over winter. So this needs to be kept growing over winter. It will not go fully dormant, especially at this size. It doesn't have the store in the comb to actually get through a long period without being watered and kept growing. So if you've got an onset banana of any type, Morellii or the snow banana for instance, you need to keep it in active growth. And if it's this size, if you can pick it up in a small pot like this, it's got no particular height to it, this needs to be kept somewhere light ideally and growth. So basically it needs treating like a house plant. It needs to be above 10 degrees at least if it's a green form, above 5-6 degrees if it's a red form, but ideally keep it in a house or a conservatory or a heated greenhouse if you're going to heat your greenhouse. Try to keep it, like I said, above 10 degrees, maybe above 15 degrees in sun, and keep watering to minimal. You don't want to overwater these in winter because they won't dry out quickly, because it won't be in a lot of growth. It'll continue growing slowly over winter, so that's why you need to give it in good light. But overall, just give it minimal amount of water just to keep the compost slightly damp at a distance of, about 4 or 5 centimeters down if you stick your finger in. So that will be kept in my house this winter because I'm not heating my greenhouse to above 10 degrees. Now there's other bananas, obviously. We've got the Lasiocarpa, Musella Lasiocarpa. This type of banana can be kept in a pot all the time for its full life. That's what I like to do. I like to pot it up into a decent sized pot over a couple of years, and then it'll flower in that size pot. So if you've got a banana like this, so Lasiocarpa, you can keep it sort of semi-dormant, so you can keep it in a greenhouse above 5 degrees. It can go down to freezing. It will take some frost as well, but I find it really hard to start into growth if it gets completely frosted off and lose all its foliage. So I would keep this above 5 degrees. Doesn't need too much light over winter because it's not going to be really in growth, it's sort of dormant. So you can keep it in a greenhouse, a conservatory, you can keep it in a cold greenhouse as well, as long as it's not going to get below 0. And a shed, a porch, somewhere like that where it's not going to get absolutely frozen solid. But ideally, if you can, keep that above 5 degrees in sort of semi-dormant state. In terms of watering, you probably won't need to water it over winter, maybe once or twice. Just check the compost. It depends exactly what compost you've got, but if it's not completely bone dry, then I wouldn't water it. It should be fine for quite a few weeks or months without any water at all. And then we've got things like Musa basjoo. Obviously, if you've got a small plant recently and you've not planted it in the ground, you have to overwinter that. Either Musa basjoo, I would keep that somewhere frost-free if it's in a pot, because it's not big enough to have lots of freezers through it. So if you've got Musa basjoo or any other type of bananas, keep it frost-free, which means normally above 5 degrees. So it might dip a little bit under that if you've got a thermostat, because if you've got a thermostat on a heater, remember, it sort of swings on and off. Give a tolerance of 2 or 3 degrees. So if you set it at 5, then you know you're going to keep it frost-free. It might dip down to 1 or 2 degrees depending how accurate the thermostat thermometer is. So any sort of bananas, definitely keep them frost-free. Keep the onsets above 5-10 degrees ideally, The Lasicarpas and the Musa basjoos, keep them above 0, but ideally around 5 degrees. Aeoniums, like this beautiful aeonium here, which is super bang, these need to be kept frost free as well. So ideally, again, we're talking about setting thermostats to 5 degrees, and aeoniums do need good light over winter because they will try to keep growing, and they'll do quite a lot of the growing sort of in the late winter months into spring. So keep this in the brightest place you've got. You can let it dry out pretty much as well, but you don't want it completely dried out for months at a time because it will start to suffer. So give it a bit of water so it's not completely dry for too long if you're keeping it in a potted plant like this. And most of them are small enough to keep as houseplants on a windowsill or a conservatory or heated greenhouse. But don't let this one really go down to 0 for too long. Because remember, when you've got the many months in winter in a greenhouse, where you might be keeping it above freezing, moisture levels can be really high, especially if you're watering other plants, and humidity is high generally in the air in winter as well. And plants like this can suffer just from being condensation on the leaves for too long and the moisture staying on the pots for too long. So try to keep it dryish and keep it above really 5 degrees if you can. So you might have lots of plants that you've been growing from seed or cuttings and they're not too big yet, and you're thinking, how shall I store that over winter? Can it go dormant? Can it be kept in active growth? In the case of this is a brugmansia. This has still got green stem, it's not got any hard wood yet, so I wouldn't want this to go dormant. So a brugmansia like this, at this size in a small pot, you need to keep really, if you can, in active growth. So again, it's treating it like a houseplant, and I would say keep this really above like 7-8 degrees. So you don't want it dipping down lower than 5 degrees, or it'll lose its leaves and it'll go dormant. And because it's so small, it might not come back well from dormancy. So I would keep that in active growth, give it good light. Again, we're talking about houseplants, talking about conservatories, but you want to keep that going over winter. Now, colocasias, obviously we talked about the pink chinas that are hardest keeping the ground. We've got others that we can dry store as well. But what about if you've got a small one, like this one here? This is Colocasia coal miner. And as you can see, it's a very small plant. It's only in it's a 7 centimetre square pot. Got nice healthy roots at the bottom, so it's growing well in there, and it's been kept nice and damp through the growing season. This now doesn't want to go dormant, so the key to keeping these alive and bulking up for future years is to keep these warm over winter. So this you want to treat as like 5-star treatment. You want to keep this in a nice, warm, sunny spot. So a bathroom might be good for this because it's got the humidity as well, but you want to keep this easily above 15 degrees. Ideally keep it in a nice warm room where you can either mist the foliage, keep it in a bathroom if it's a warm bathroom, or keep it in a conservatory if you heat that as part of your household heating as well. You can keep these alternatively on a heat mat, so you could have a cooler greenhouse where you're not heating the whole greenhouse, but you might put this in like a propagator. So I've used like a Vitapod propagator before, and what I've done is put these in, keep the base heat to over 20 degrees on the thermostat. The air temperature might only be about 10 degrees, but the roots and the soil will be kept nice and toasty at about 15-20 degrees, and that will be good enough to keep this going through winter. You will need additional lighting if you do that as well. You need to keep this nice and bright. So if you've got any of the smaller growing colocasias, the Hawaiian ones, the really nice variegation ones, the dark-leaved ones, these are ones that you've got to keep either in active growth in your house or trick it a bit by putting it in a heated propagator. Agaves, so this is a nice variegated Agave Americana, and any agave of any species in a small pot like this needs to be kept dry over winter and frost free, because any agave at this size, even the hardy ones, will struggle if you planted them in the ground. So if they're in pots at this size, they need to be frost free. So that doesn't mean in a heated space or for all types. You can keep this in a cold greenhouse for many types. Some of the more variegated ones and the more tender species, obviously you want to have some heat in your greenhouse so it doesn't go below 0. So again, set a thermostat at 5 degrees to keep it frost-free, and that'll be fine. And you can stop watering this in September, and this won't need any water now until about March next year. So whatever sort of agave you've got, whatever type of species, if it's in a pot and you can pick up the pot, then you're going to have to keep it frost-free. If it's in a great big pot and it's one of the hardy types, then you can keep it against the house wall, in a porch, somewhere like that where it will be kept relatively dry. Potted Echeverias, like this beautiful one here, most of these are tender, so if it's potted, again, we're talking about frost-free conditions, keeping it above 5 degrees. You want to give these good light as well, because they will get quite stretched as they try to grow over winter and into spring. So give this good light if you can. It's not the end of the world if you're keeping it super dry and sort of dormant and frost-free, but ideally give this good light. You can leave some types outside, but most need to be kept frost-free. Now, this is a lovely plant. This is party time. This is a very tender plant, and I normally take cuttings for this over winter. But if you've got a potted specimen like this, and this goes for any other sort of tender plant that you've had in pots over the summer period, you need to keep this in active growth over winter. So again, we're talking about keeping it as a house plant. This will be fine in any sort of bright room or a bathroom. Or you can do the trick where you keep it in a heated propagator so it's nice and toasty at the roots, even if the foliage isn't as warm. As long as you're keeping the roots and the compost warm, then the plant will get through. Just be really mindful, any sort of foliage plants that are tender are susceptible to rot in winter, but you can get the furry white mould on these and rot as well, so you have to be really careful to keep the foliage really dry. So water from below, don't water from the top, and this should get through. Ventilation is key in winter, especially if you're keeping things in a propagator area to keep them warm. You still want to ventilate that and ventilate your greenhouse on warm days as well. Now, palm trees in pots, and I'm talking about hardy palm trees as well as tender ones. Now this can confuse people because you think, well, for instance here I've got a Trachycarpus palm, and this is a hardy palm growing all over the UK outside, no problem at all. They'll self-seed as well, so you'll get seedlings coming up that's been cross-pollinated, so they'll be happy. But if you've got a potted specimen like this you can pick up in one hand, I would keep this frost-free in winter. That is mainly because although the foliage is hardy enough to get through pretty much all winters in the UK, the roots are a lot more tender. Because we're in a pot, then obviously frost can hit those roots and damage the roots. Even if it doesn't kill the plant, you can get a lot of damage on the outside of the roots on cold nights when it gets below sort of -5, -6, which doesn't hurt the foliage. So I would keep this somewhere frost-free. It doesn't need too much light over winter, so anywhere like a shed or a garage is fine. Greenhouse is obviously better, so a cold greenhouse will be fine, somewhere where it will not freeze all the way through. Or you can just bring them against the house wall and it'll benefit from the warmth from the house radiating out. And obviously if it's a sunny wall and the sun hits it, it'll stop it freezing through. So keep that somewhere, it doesn't have to be frost-free, but somewhere it's not going to thoroughly freeze in winter. Obviously if it's a tender type of palm tree that you grow in pots, you're going to need to keep that heated in the greenhouse. So even things like this, hardy Trachycarpus, if it's small, I'll keep that somewhere frost-free. But you really only need to do that if it's going to be really cold. If it's sort of a mild winter, you don't need to bring it in. So just be mindful of the weather. If you have enough time and effort, you can sort of bring them in and out of a greenhouse, because you don't want it in active growth in a warm greenhouse or conservatory. You want to just keep it as it is. So treat it hard so it doesn't get pests and diseases, and it will grow strongly the next year. So it's a bit of a balancing act with these, but basically just don't want this to freeze through and to be in a block of ice over winter. And in terms of watering, just check on it. Don't let it completely dry out, which can happen, and don't let it be sat in sodden water, especially if it's on the ground and the drainage isn't good from the holes at the base. Make sure it doesn't get waterlogged and then freeze through. Now, gingers grown in pots. It's a good way to grow them, especially when you're just propagating them and you're trying to bulk up supplies. There's two types of gingers. You've got deciduous gingers and you've got evergreen gingers. Deciduous gingers are dead easy to look after if you've been growing them in pots, because they'll start dying off as you get into autumn, close to winter. You can just chop all the foliage off and basically keep your potted rhizome anywhere that's frost free. So you can keep it in trays on the greenhouse bench, you keep it in the attic, you keep it in a cupboard, anywhere where it's going to be sort of dark and still and not too hot and not absolutely freezing. So I would keep them somewhere, again, keep saying it, but keep it frost free. Don't really worry about it over winter. Just check it's not completely bone dry, because it can be hard to restart them in spring if it's completely bone dry. But again, you shouldn't really need to water these until you need to get them into active growth in spring. If you've got an evergreen ginger, which most are, to be honest, like this one here, this is Verity with the variegation, any growth over winter will struggle next year, and the growth it's already got from the current season, this will slowly die off when the light levels drop in winter. So you can basically treat it in the same way as the deciduous ones, whereby over winter this foliage will get more and more tatty, and in spring you can cut off all this growth, what it's made over winter and the previous year's growth, and then let it get into new growth in spring. So what I'll do with this one is basically leave this as it is over winter, keep it frost free, so above 5 degrees as I keep saying, and then as the season winter progresses, I'll watch the foliage and probably cut it all off by the time we get to sort of January, February, and then wait for the new growth in March onwards. This is a beautiful begonia, and we're going to talk about two types of begonia now. This is an evergreen type that'll carry on growing, a cane begonia, and this is Begonia luxurians. This one particularly is a little bit fussy because it doesn't want to be dry, doesn't want to be too wet, and needs the humidity just right to be looking happy. This one's been outside all summer and it's been kept in a shaded spot, and I would keep it somewhere shaded over winter as well in a greenhouse. So don't put it in a sunny windowsill in your house. So a bathroom is a really good place to put this, so it has filtered light and it's not too hot and not too cold, and it's got that humidity. Or you can keep it in a heated greenhouse, but you really want to keep this above 12 degrees if you can, so it's looking okay over winter. And then come spring, any tatty foliage you can cut off, and just be careful how you water it over winter. You don't want this sitting in water, and you don't want it completely drying out, because it will struggle to get back into growth. So a little bit more fussy, the cane begonias, but basically you're going to have to treat this as a house plant, about 15-20 degrees, but no lower than 12 degrees. And then we come to the other type of begonia. This is a deciduous begonia. This is Begonia torsa with its absolutely huge leaves. This will get much bigger in the ground, and this is a hardy begonia. But whatever type of deciduous begonias you've got, or some even evergreen non-cane begonias, what you can do is either let the foliage die off, be frosted off, or you can cut off all the foliage and just leave it in its pot, again somewhere frost-free, above 5 degrees, and you won't need to water that at all until next spring, until sort of March, April time, and then it'll come back into growth. So really, really easy to look after. So in a few weeks' time, I'll be cutting off all this foliage, but I'll probably see the signs of it going yellow anyway as we go into autumn. So that's when I know to cut back the foliage. But for now, I'm going to enjoy the flowers and the great big green leaves. Now we have cacti, and the good news about cacti is most of the cacti that we grow sort of as pot plants for outdoor culture are hardy if they're kept really, really dry over winter. So this one here is colocacti. I'll keep this frost free because I don't want it to go below freezing because I've got space to do so, but you can keep this in a completely unheated greenhouse if you wish. So it can go down to -10, -15 in some cases for a lot of cacti species, providing it is absolutely bone powder dry at the roots, so completely dry. So you need to have stopped watering these really sort of early September so that they've dried out and be kept in a cold greenhouse over winter. So I would start putting these into the cold greenhouse sort of in September time, maybe October, so they've got time to dry out before it turns cold in November, December and onwards. Of course you can keep it as a houseplant if you wish as well, but for most, not all, but for most cacti you can get away with not heating these over winter, or to play on the safe side, if you're not sure if it's a tender or a hardy type, do keep it frost free at 5 degrees or above so that it's not going to freeze through. But again, don't water these, keep these really dry over winter. Now I said I was going to share a tip with you about how to keep pretty much any plant over winter without it dying, especially if you don't know what type it is. Basically it's a bit of a cheat, but you're going to have to keep it as a house plant and keep it on the dry side. So whatever plant you've got, all these plants here, I've talked about different ways of overwintering them as a potted plant, but if you're unsure, treat it as a house plant, give it good light and it will get through winter, providing you don't overwater it. So if you've enjoyed this video, think about subscribing if you've not done so. If you want to know how to overwinter all these plants and similar plants that are big and they're in the ground, I'll talk about that in a different video and I'll give a link to that now so you can check that out and see how to overwinter bigger bananas, bigger tropical and exotic plants in your garden and how to do that. So thanks for watching. Thank you for watching this edition of Exotic Garden UK. Join me next week where I'll do more in the garden.